So this is the physical price that is paid when online disinformation campaigns are allowed to continue unchecked. Joining us now to cut through the propaganda is Liz Harrington, the national spokesperson for the Republican National Committee. Liz, I've seen some of your comments recently on social media. You've been critical of the way that CNN, among other media outlets, has handled broadly this outbreak, but specifically when it comes to holding China accountable for a lot of its actions. So why is it that CNN, for example, is issuing basically press releases coming out of China, taking their numbers for fact, I should say, and kind of explaining the same thing that China is trying to explain through their disinformation campaigns?
Well, unfortunately, our mainstream media reflexively takes any position that is against our duly elected president of the United States. But oftentimes, this makes them align with enemies of the United States. And so we've seen it again and again. This isn't actually a new phenomenon, but you would think during a global pandemic that was actually started and was born out of a communist regime's cover-up, you would think they would have more clarity on these types of issues and have an interest in reporting the facts. But unfortunately, we've seen the mainstream media, we've seen New York Times and CNN and MSNBC taking the side of the honor of terrorists. If you remember when al-Baghdadi was killed, you had the New York Times basically running a piece saying, well, President Trump said he was whimpering and crying. Is that really true? To the effect that they were defending his honor and saying that, oh, it would be better if he wasn't. You have that same kind of phenomenon, unfortunately, happening right here, which is, oh, well, China, their numbers, which we can't trust, are lower than the United States. Ooh, now we can blame President Trump for this and make him look bad, when in reality, this was a pandemic that was caused out of China, their cover up, and certainly looks like at least misleading, or the World Health Organization taking their word for it at the very least, spreading misinformation about the virus really cost not just the United States, but the entire world so much time and critical time to respond to this. So it's absolutely appalling to see mainstream media just taking and repeating and regurgitating talking points from an authoritarian regime just so they can try to score political points against an American president. And they really need to take a step back and look in the mirror. But unfortunately, when President Trump shined that mirror for them yesterday out of the briefing room, CNN cut away, MSNBC cut away. They can't see the truth of their own failures in the coverage during this pandemic.
In regard to that al-Baghdadi thing, I believe it was at the New York Times or the Washington Post described him as an austere religious scholar. I mean, that's something that...
Washington Post.
It was the Washington Post. I hope that my obituary is so kind when that eventually happens. But when it comes to China, too, so, for example, in 2016, a lot of the president's critics said that Russia was on his side. They launched a disinformation campaign in the United States saying that they were supporting President Trump in his election over Hillary Clinton. Are there concerns from Republicans that China may be trying to do something similar in favor of Joe Biden? We've seen Joe Biden talk glowingly about China in the past. We know that he has more connections to China and would be more friendly from a trade standpoint. Are there concerns that China may be trying to launch an information campaign in the United States to hurt the Trump re-election effort?
Well, it's very interesting. After years of screaming about Russia and election interference, this entire time, anyone that could look at this objectively always knew the greater threat was China for every world affairs. And if you listen to what Attorney General William Barr just recently said, there's no question on any issue, whether it's not just election security, but it's issues of national security, issues of trade, stealing our intellectual property, militarily, across the board, China presents a much bigger threat than Russia ever did. And so Democrats, it's just amazing that they used and spread and knew it was disinformation, according to that footnote in the Horowitz Inspector General report against this president. We need to make sure that our elections are secure and safe. But we also need to get to the bottom of that, because it ties into your first question about this media bias against the president. Now it's on record. Now we know. And there needs to be an accounting also with the mainstream media to say, why did you just automatically report whatever leak your intel source gave you? Were you just too lazy, or were you corrupt? Because that is the question. We know this was nonsense, and they wasted 3 years on it. So I know President Trump will make sure, and the Trump administration is working very hard to secure our elections. It's also a good point to make about what Democrats are trying to do during this pandemic to change the way we do our elections to give themselves an edge at the ballot box. I know with President Trump in charge and with his administration, they're going to take every safeguard they can, and we will have a safe and free and fair election come November.
And of course, U.S. Attorney John Durham is currently looking into the inception in the investigation that you're talking about. So hopefully we should have some answers regarding the early days of the investigation when it came to George Papadopoulos, Carter Page, those investigatory efforts. But I want to pivot back to CNN for a brief moment, because anchor Chris Cuomo was on a radio show recently where he called the network hyper-partisan. In fact, he said that the network is trafficking in things that I think are ridiculous, and even going as far to say it's not worth his time anymore, launching speculation that he may be removing himself from CNN due to the coverage. He hasn't followed up on that quite yet. But speaking of CNN, is it a new thing where they're super critical of Republicans, especially the president, or is this something that has just been now being called out and has been taking place for a lot longer than we may have been talking about?
I think it's been building for some time. I think you've seen all mainstream outlets really for a long time. Suddenly they have such favorable opinions of George W. Bush now that he's long out of power. They were calling him Hitler back then too. So it's always been a bias against Republicans, but I think it's a new level. And when you look at CNN, their reaction to the briefing earlier this week, just cutting away, they changed their chyron to say President Trump's having a meltdown. It's propaganda. Well, someone was having a meltdown, and it wasn't the president. It was certainly CNN. And it's interesting to hear what Chris Cuomo said. We'll have to see what he ends up doing. But any objective viewer knows, and that's why their audience is dwindling by so much, that it is so hyper-partisan. It is so out of touch. And they're not even really getting much support from Democrats and the far left, even though they're trading in all of their credibility. Their approval rating by the mainstream media is totally down the drain.
You don't even have to go back to George Bush. Mitt Romney was villainized. He was called a racist as well when he was running, and now he's kind of a media darling for being an anti-Trumper in these times as well. So I think that these short cycles we forget about them, but I think they always return back to their roots. And I think you are exactly spot on for saying that the George Bush example is very well put, but we don't even have to go that far back. Liz Harrington, I really appreciate you coming on, breaking down the media coverage, helping us kind of get through the noise and get the news. Thank you very much.